Hey there. I'm so glad you stopped by. The other day I was digging through history and stumbled upon a story that literally blew my mind. We're used to modern wars, to drones, to satellite navigation and all that. But let's imagine for a minute that we've traveled back more than 100 years, right into the thick of it during World War I. Got that image? Now, forget everything you know about war because back then, it was complete, absolute hell. Imagine endless fields, churned into a quagmire of mud and water. The sky is permanently gray from smoke, the ground shakes from shell explosions, and every breath is a mix of gunpowder, death, and despair. This was the Western Front, a line of trenches stretching from the North Sea all the way to Switzerland. And that line was stuck, deadlocked. Neither side could move. The world had gone insane and was trapped in a bloody slaughterhouse from which there seemed no escape. And today I want to tell you the story not just of a tank. It's the story of a little iron box on tracks, affectionately nicknamed Little Willie. This was where it all began, the start of a path that turned the entire art of war on its head. We'll talk about how despair and hopelessness gave birth to a brilliant idea, how this little guy failed his test but gave life to real monsters that finally broke the vicious cycle of trench warfare. This is a story of genius, stupidity, heroism, and how one single innovation can change the world. So, make yourself comfortable, grab some tea or something stronger. It's going to be interesting, long, and I promise very atmospheric. The deadlock that trapped the world. Just think about the numbers for a second. By the end of 1915, the war, which was supposed to be over before the autumn leaves fell, had turned into a giant meat grinder. The generals were still thinking in 19th century terms. Fancy uniforms, cavalry charges, bayonet assaults. But the reality was this. The Maxim machine gun could mow down entire regiments in a matter of minutes. Let me explain the horror of it. Picture the front line. On your side, trenches. On the enemy's side, trenches. In between, no man's land, all torn up by shells, soaked by rain, and strung with multiple rows of barbed wire. And there you are, a soldier. You hear the officer's whistle, climb out of the trench, and start your advance. You walk, because running in full gear through the mud is impossible. And on the other side, they're watching you, aiming their machine guns. It wasn't war. It was a slaughterhouse. Why was some new machine necessary? Because the cavalry, the pride of any army, got bogged down in the mud and was shot to pieces before they even got close. The infantry couldn't get through the wire and were mowed down. The only god of war was artillery. But even that couldn't guarantee success. After days of preparatory bombardment, the attackers would still be met by a surviving machine gunner in a crater who would cut them down. They needed something that could carry armor, haul a cannon, crush the wire with its tracks, and not be afraid of bullets. The idea had been floating around since the time of Leonardo da Vinci and science fiction writers like H.G. Wells, but it wasn't until the 20th century that the technology finally caught up. The birth of Little Willie, engineering marvel and curse. And that's where engineers William Tritton and Lieutenant Walter Gordon Wilson enter the scene. Picture the workshops of Foster and Company in Lincoln, England. They had a task from the Landships Committee, sounds cool, right? Which was overseen personally by Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty. Why were Navy men meddling in land warfare? Because the Admiralty actually understood armor and engines, unlike the Army generals who were initially pretty skeptical. In the summer of 1915, they started building a prototype. They based it on an American bullock tractor, bought some lengthened tracks, and started piecing it together. And by September 1915, he was born, Little Willie. When I read the technical specs, I was both amused and horrified. It was a box on tracks. Huge, clumsy. Just listen to these stats. Weight, about 16 to 18 tons. Engine, 105 horsepower, about the same as a modern compact car. Speed, max on road, 2 miles per hour, 3.2 kilometers per hour. Cross country, even slower, about 1 mile per hour. Crawled like a turtle. Crew, 6 men, but inside was a nightmare. There was a massive 13-liter Daimler Knight engine that guzzled gas and got incredibly hot. Inside temperatures could soar above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, 50 degrees Celsius. Inside, the engine roared so loudly the crew had to communicate with hand signals. Exhaust fumes, gasoline vapors, and gunpowder smoke mixed into such a hellish cocktail that many drivers passed out even before the battle. There was no suspension at all. The tracks were bolted directly to the hull. So it shook so violently that, as tankers said, your teeth chattered on their own. But the main problem wasn't that. Little Willie was designed to cross trenches and craters. And here he failed miserably. His tracks were too short, and the hull shape didn't allow him to climb over wide ditches. He would just get stuck, high-centered, and that was it. Can you imagine? A machine built to overcome obstacles couldn't overcome the main obstacle of the war. Mother. How Willie's mistakes changed the world. Wilson, one of the designers, looked at this and thought, this won't do. They needed to change the concept completely, and they made a brilliant move. They abandoned the idea that a tank was just an armored tractor with a gun on top. They made the tracks rhomboid-shaped, running all the way around the hull, over the top and underneath. Thus, a new prototype was born, initially called Centipede, and then affectionately Mother, or Big Willie, to distinguish it from Little Willie. Now the tracks encircled the hull like a tractor's tracks go around the wheels, but on a massive scale. This allowed it to climb over wide trenches and high parapets. The guns and machine guns were moved from the roof to side sponsons, box-like structures on the sides. This made the machine more stable and allowed it to fire along the length of the trenches. It was Mother that became the prototype for the first production tank, the Mark I, and Little Willie remained in history as the world's first built prototype, the grandfather of all tanks. He never saw combat, never fired a shot, but he proved one crucial thing. The idea works, a tracked vehicle can crawl across a battlefield. Baptism of fire, fiasco or breakthrough. Now let's fast forward to 1916, the Battle of the Somme. It was absolute hell. Starting July 1st, the British and French tried to break the German lines. On the very first day of the battle, July 1st, the British Army suffered over 57,000 casualties, killed and wounded, in a single day, all for an advance of a few hundred yards, which would later be washed away by rain or lost to German counterattacks. General Haig, the British commander-in-chief, was in despair. He needed to justify the horrific losses and achieve some kind of result. His staff officers advised waiting, accumulating more tanks, and then striking with a concentrated fist. But Haig said, no, let's use them now on September 15th. Let's just try something new. And so came the morning of September 15th. German soldiers, exhausted from endless shelling, looked out of their trenches and, according to historians, their blood ran cold. Emerging from the mist were monsters, clanking, growling, smoke-belching beasts. But, as is often the case, reality was more prosaic than the horror. Out of the 49 Mark I tanks allocated for the front, only 32 managed to reach the starting line. The rest broke down en route or got stuck. And of those 32, only 18 actually advanced in the attack. The rest either got stuck in craters, broke down, or were knocked out by artillery. The tanks were spread out in small groups with little coordination with the infantry. The crews were green, many in their first battle. The result was, well, modest. In places, they caused panic, captured the villages of Flers and Courcelette, and advanced maybe a couple of miles. But it wasn't a crushing defeat of the enemy. It was more of a demonstration, a firecracker, as some historians say. The Germans quickly recovered. They started firing at the tanks directly with field guns. The armor on those first rhomboids was only bulletproof for stopping shrapnel. A direct hit from a shell turned the tank into a tin can full of minced meat inside. But the psychological effect was crucial. The press screamed about a new wonder weapon. Soldiers at the front saw that there was a machine that could go through the wire and not die under bullets. And General Haig, despite the modest success, uttered his historic phrase, "Where the tanks advanced, we took our objectives. Where they did not, we failed. Build as many as possible. Tanks roll from failure to triumph." After the Somme, the work began on correcting mistakes. Tankers learned to fight, engineers worked on reliability, and generals learned to think. And by 1917, they were ready for a rematch. The Battle of Cambrai in November 1917 was the moment the tanks truly showed their worth. The British assembled over 400 Mark IV tanks, an improved version, on a narrow sector of the front. And they used new tactics, a massed attack without days of preliminary bombardment to preserve surprise. Artillery fired on specific targets, but the tanks led the infantry charge. The Germans, taught by bitter experience, had widened their trenches, thinking the tanks couldn't cross them. But the British had devised a brilliantly simple solution. Each tank carried a huge bundle of sticks, a fascine. Approaching a ditch, the tank would drop this bundle in, filling the trench and creating a crossing. The effect was staggering. German soldiers panicked and fled, abandoning their machine guns. The British broke through the defenses to a depth of 6 to 8 miles in a single day, with minimal casualties. It was a revolution. For the first time since 1914, a static defense had been breached, not at the cost of millions of lives, but through technology and ingenuity. The economics of war and tank loans. There's another interesting aspect I discovered. Tanks became not just a military weapon, but an economic one too. By 1917 to 18, the war had exhausted all sides completely. There was a shortage of men and money, and the British government came up with a brilliant PR campaign: tank loans or tank banks. Imagine, a real battle-scarred tank arrives in a city. It's placed in the central square like an attraction. People could climb on it, touch it, take pictures. Beside it stood military personnel and recruiters, urging people to buy war bonds. Cities competed to see who could raise the most money. In Monmouth, Wales, they hoped to raise £20,000. They raised £54,000 in a single day, and this when a worker's weekly wage was about 10 to 12 shillings. Across the country, they raised around £300 million. In today's money, that's billions. Tanks became a symbol of hope, a symbol that technological progress could overcome the death and mud of the trenches. The legacy of Little Willie. Why it matters today. Of course, tanks weren't the magic wand that single-handedly ended the war. The war ended due to a combination of factors: Germany's exhaustion, the blockade, the arrival of American troops, and the sheer war weariness of the soldiers. But the role of tanks in the final phase of the war, in the 100 Days Offensive of 1918, was colossal. They allowed advances with acceptable losses. So why is Little Willie so important? Because he was the first. He was a mistake, an experiment, clumsy and funny. But it was by seeing his shortcomings, the inability to cross a wide trench, that Wilson conceived the rhomboidal track design. Without him, the mark I would never have been born. My personal opinion. Looking at Little Willie, I understand that every great breakthrough starts with a clumsy attempt. We often think geniuses get everything right the first time. But in reality, it's trial and error. Little Willie is a symbol of the engineering courage to admit your first idea is flawed, and then go and build a second, better one. Today, that tank sits in a museum in Bovington, England. Rusty, old, with bullet holes and dents. School kids and adults look at it and probably think, what a piece of junk. But when I look at the photos, I see a revolutionary. World War I ended on November 11, 1918. Cost millions of lives. And maybe, if the generals had understood the value of these tin cans, these landships, these Little Willies and mothers sooner, the slaughter might have been a little less. Technology should be there to protect a soldier's life, not just to make killing more efficient. That's the main lesson I take from this story. So what did you think of that deep dive into history? I tried to convey not just the dry facts, but the horror, the genius, and the hope that accompanied the birth of the Armored Corps. To me, the story of Little Willie is a story about how the human mind searches for a way out of the most hopeless situations. And now, my friend, I have a huge favor to ask. If you found this even slightly interesting, if you learned something new or saw an old war in a new light, please write to me in the comments. Your opinion really matters to me. What grabbed your attention? What should I talk about next? The German A7V? The French Renault FT? Or maybe how pilots fought in World War I? And most importantly, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. There will be plenty more interesting stuff here, long and deep conversations about history, about how we got to where we are, and why you can't have a future without a past. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next big story. Thanks for reading all the way to the end. You're a true enthusiast. Talk soon.